The morning sun rose over Cedar Falls like it had every day for the past 12 years since the settlement was built. Jacob Stone stood on his porch watching the golden light spread across the cornfields that stretched to the horizon. He sipped his coffee and listened to the sounds of his village waking up. Children laughed as they ran to school. Dogs barked at nothing in particular. The old water pump creaked as someone filled their bucket for the day. Jacob had been the mayor of Cedar Falls for 8 years now. Before that, he had been a military engineer for the Earth Defense Force. He came to this outer rim world called New Haven to find peace after too many years of war. The 300 people who lived in Cedar Falls had trusted him to keep them safe and help their small community grow. Most days that meant fixing broken equipment or settling disputes about property lines. Dr. Lisa Park walked past his house carrying her medical bag. She waved and smiled as she headed to check on Mrs. Murphy, who had been feeling sick lately. Lisa was the only doctor in Cedar Falls, and she took care of everyone from newborn babies to old farmers with bad backs. She had come to New Haven 5 years ago after her husband died in a transport accident. The quiet life of a village doctor suited her much better than the busy hospitals on Earth. Sam Rodriguez was already at work in his garage behind the main street. Jacob could hear him hammering on something metal. Sam could fix anything that had gears or circuits or engines. The farmers brought him their broken tractors and the housewives brought him their washing machines. He also liked to tinker with new inventions in his spare time. Most of them did not work very well, but Sam never gave up trying. Maria Santos opened her general store at exactly 8 o'clock like she did every morning. She sold everything from groceries to farming tools to children's toys. Maria had a talent for getting the supplies the village needed from the trading ships that came through the system. She could negotiate better deals than anyone Jacob had ever met. The villagers joked that Maria could talk a rock into buying shoes. Danny Mitchell was already out in his wheat fields even though he was only 22 years old. His parents had died in a farming accident when he was 18, and he had been running their farm ever since. Danny worked harder than anyone else in the village. He dreamed of expanding his farm, and maybe one day owning the biggest wheat operation on New Haven. For now, he was happy just growing enough food to feed his neighbors. None of them knew that high above their planet, alien ships were moving through space towards Cedar Falls. Corvani Empire had decided that humans were spreading too far across the galaxy. They needed to be stopped before they became a real threat. Commander Zektar had chosen Cedar Falls as his target because it looked weak and helpless. Destroying it would send a message to all humans about what happened when they tried to claim territory that belonged to the Empire. The first sign of trouble came at lunchtime when the communication relay went silent. Jacob tried to contact the planetary capital but got only static. He walked to Sam's garage to ask him to check the equipment. Sam looked at the radio system and shook his head. Everything seemed to be working fine on their end. Jacob felt a cold knot form in his stomach. During his military days, he had learned to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. He activated the emergency protocols he had quietly installed around the village years ago. Hidden sensors came online, weapon caches unlocked. Warning signals went out to a few trusted villagers who had military experience. The Corvani ships dropped out of hyperspace at 2 in the afternoon. 3 massive cruisers and a dozen smaller attack craft took positions above Cedar Falls. The ships were sleek and black with strange curves that hurt the eyes to look at. Energy weapons charged with a high-pitched whine that made the dogs howl and the children cry. Commander Zektar opened a communication channel to the village. His voice boomed from every speaker and radio in Cedar Falls. He spoke in accented English that sounded like gravel grinding together. He told the humans they had 30 minutes to surrender completely or be destroyed. There would be no negotiation and no mercy for those who resisted. Jacob gathered the village council in the town hall. Maria Santos argued they should surrender to protect the children. Dr. Lisa Park said they might be able to negotiate some kind of deal. Sam Rodriguez wanted to fight back with everything they had. Danny Mitchell sat quietly listening to the arguments with his hands clenched into fists. Jacob made the decision. He activated every defense he had secretly prepared over the years. Hidden missile launchers rose from concealed positions around the village. Energy shields flickered to life around the most important buildings. The farming equipment in Sam's garage transformed as hidden weapon systems came online. Tractors became mobile gun platforms. Irrigation pipes became rocket launchers. Grain silos opened to reveal surface-to-air missiles. The battle began exactly 30 minutes after the ultimatum. The Corvani expected the humans to either surrender or die quickly under the first bombardment. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to stay down. Every barn and farmhouse seemed to hide weapons. Every farmer seemed to know exactly where to aim to hurt the alien ships. Sam's inventions that had never worked properly suddenly came to life as weapons of war. His experimental energy shield generator protected the school long enough for the children to evacuate. His failed flying machine became a guided missile that took out a Corvani fighter. His broken communication device started jamming enemy signals across the battlefield. Dr. Lisa Park set up a field hospital in the basement of her clinic. She treated wounded villagers while energy blasts shook the building above her. Maria Santos organized supply lines to get ammunition and medical supplies to where they were needed most. Danny Mitchell drove a weaponized harvester through enemy lines to rescue trapped families. For 6 hours, the villagers of Cedar Falls held off the Corvani attack. They shot down 4 fighters and damaged one of the cruisers badly enough that it had to retreat. Commander Zektar grew more and more angry as his easy victory turned into a costly battle. He began to understand that these humans were not the weak prey he had expected, but numbers and technology eventually won. The Corvani had more ships and bigger guns and shields the humans could not penetrate. One by one, the village defenses fell silent. The missile launchers ran out of ammunition. The energy shields failed as their generators overloaded. The improvised weapons broke down under constant use. By evening, Cedar Falls was burning. The grain silos exploded in towers of flame that could be seen from orbit. The main street was full of rubble from collapsed buildings. Bodies of villagers and aliens lay scattered across the battlefield. The sweet smell of burning wheat mixed with smoke and blood and death. Jacob Stone sat in the ruins of his house with his hands zip-tied behind his back. Around him, the survivors of Cedar Falls knelt in the dirt, while Corvani soldiers pointed weapons at them. He counted maybe 100 people left alive out of 300. Dr. Lisa Park had a bandage around her head, but her eyes were still fierce. Sam Rodriguez was bleeding from a cut on his arm, but he glared at their captors with pure hatred. Maria Santos held a crying child against her chest. Danny Mitchell stared at the burning remains of his wheat field with tears running down his face. Commander Zektar stood before the prisoners and announced they would be taken to the Corvani homeworld as examples of what happened to humans who dared to resist the Empire. The survivors would spend the rest of their lives in labor camps. Their story would be broadcast across the galaxy as proof that humanity was weak and easily defeated. As the transport ships landed to collect the prisoners, Jacob Stone made a silent promise. Cedar Falls had fallen, but its people were still alive. Somehow, some way, he would find a way to make the Corvani pay for what they had done. The war was not over. It was just beginning. The transport ships carried the survivors of Cedar Falls through hyperspace for 7 days before reaching Corvax Prime. Jacob Stone spent those days in a cramped metal cage, talking quietly with the other prisoners about what they might expect when they arrived. Dr. Lisa Park used strips torn from her shirt to treat wounds that the Corvani guards ignored. Sam Rodriguez studied the ship's systems whenever the guards were not watching. Maria Santos kept track of which prisoners were holding up well and which ones might need extra help. Danny Mitchell stared out the small windows at the stars and thought about his wheat fields burning. When the ships finally dropped out of hyperspace, the humans got their first look at the capital world of the Corvani Empire. Corvax Prime was a planet covered in gleaming metal cities that stretched from pole to pole. Massive towers reached up into the clouds. Flying vehicles moved between the buildings in organized streams. Everything looked perfect and ordered and cold. The prisoners were loaded onto ground transports that drove through the city streets toward the industrial district. Jacob watched through the windows as they passed monuments celebrating Corvani military victories. Statues of armored warriors stood in every plaza. Banners hung from buildings showing the symbols of conquered worlds. The message was clear: the Corvani Empire had defeated everyone who opposed them, and the humans would be no different. The labor camp was a collection of metal barracks surrounded by energy fences in the shadow of a massive factory complex. Thousands of aliens from dozens of different worlds worked here as prisoners of the Empire. There were reptilian Surthak with scales that changed color when they were angry, insectoid Velnari, whose 4 arms could work twice as fast as human hands, aquatic delphins who needed special breathing masks to survive in the dry air. All of them wore the same gray prison uniforms and the same look of defeated hopelessness. The camp commander was a Corvani, officer named Sub-Commander Velkath, who enjoyed making speeches about the superiority of his race. He told the new human prisoners they would work 12 hours a day, maintaining the systems that kept the capital city running. They would be fed just enough to stay alive and healthy enough to work. Any resistance would be met with immediate execution. Any attempt to escape would result in the death of 10 other prisoners. Jacob and the other survivors were separated into different work groups. He was assigned to the Power Distribution Center, where massive energy conduits carried electricity to different parts of the city. Dr. Lisa Park was sent to the factory medical station, where she would treat injured workers just well enough to get them back to their jobs. Sam Rodriguez was put to work maintaining the automated systems that controlled everything, from traffic lights to waste disposal. Maria Santos was assigned to the supply depot where goods were distributed throughout the camp. Danny Mitchell was sent to the agriculture section where food was grown in underground hydroponic farms. The work was hard and the days were long, but Jacob used every moment to learn about their prison. During his shifts in the power center, he memorized the layout of the electrical systems that fed the entire capital city. He noted which circuits were heavily protected and which ones might be vulnerable to sabotage. He studied the work schedules of the Corvani technicians and figured out when different areas would be unguarded. Dr. Lisa Park quickly discovered that her medical skills were desperately needed throughout the camp. The Corvani guards only provided basic medical care, and many prisoners suffered from injuries and diseases that went untreated. She began trading her food rations for medical supplies smuggled in by sympathetic workers. Soon aliens from every species in the camp were coming to her for help with everything from broken bones to infected wounds. Her patients told her things the guards did not want prisoners to know. The Corvani Empire was not as strong as it appeared. Several colony worlds had been experiencing riots and rebellions. The economy was struggling to support the massive military needed to keep so many species under control. There were political factions within the Corvani government that disagreed about how to handle the growing unrest. Sam Rodriguez found that the Corvani had become lazy about maintaining their automated systems. They trusted their machines so completely that they rarely checked to see if everything was working properly. This gave Sam opportunities to make small changes that would not be noticed right away, but could be very useful later. He began installing hidden backdoors in communication networks and emergency overrides in security systems. Working in the supply depot gave Maria Santos access to prisoners from every part of the camp. She quickly established trading networks that moved everything from extra food to handmade tools between different work groups. Her ability to negotiate fair deals earned her respect from aliens who had been enemies of each other for generations. Soon she was managing an underground economy that the guards knew about but chose to ignore because it kept the prisoners calm. Danny Mitchell struggled more than the others with their new life. He had never been away from his farm before, and the metal walls and artificial lights of the camp made him feel sick. But slowly he began to realize that many of the other prisoners felt the same way. They all had homes and families and dreams they had been forced to give up. When he talked about his wheat fields and his plans to expand his farm someday, other prisoners began sharing their own stories. 3 months into their imprisonment, the survivors of Cedar Falls had their first secret meeting. They gathered in a storage room during a shift change when the guards were distracted. Jacob had made contact with resistance members from several alien species who were willing to work together. Dr. Lisa Park had built a network of sympathetic prisoners throughout the camp. Sam Rodriguez had identified weaknesses in the city's infrastructure that could be exploited. Maria Santos had established supply lines that could move people and equipment without detection. Danny Mitchell had become a symbol of hope for prisoners who had given up on ever going home. They began to plan something that had never been attempted before, a coordinated uprising that would involve every species in the camp. The goal was not just to escape, but to strike a blow against the Corvani Empire that would inspire rebellions on other worlds. They would use their knowledge of the city's systems against their captors. They would turn the Corvani's own technology against them. The planning had to be done in absolute secrecy. Meetings were held in different locations every time using hand signals and coded messages that Sam had developed. Information was passed through Dr. Lisa's medical network and Maria's trading system. Danny helped recruit new members by telling them stories about Cedar Falls and how a small village had fought back against impossible odds. They learned that the best time to strike would be during the Festival of Conquest, which happened once a year to celebrate Corvani military victories. During the festival, the city's defenses would be focused on protecting the celebration, while most of the military leadership would be gathered in one place. The automated systems would be running with minimal supervision. It was the perfect opportunity if they could organize enough people to make it work. But first they had to survive 6 more months of imprisonment while secretly building the largest resistance network in the history of Corvax Prime. Every day brought new challenges as they tried to stay alive and keep their plans hidden from guards who were trained to detect rebellion. Some prisoners were caught and executed. Others lost hope and betrayed their fellow prisoners for better food or easier work assignments. Jacob Stone kept the survivors of Cedar Falls focused on their ultimate goal. They would not just escape from this prison, they would make the Corvani Empire pay for destroying their home. The village of Cedar Falls had been burned to the ground, but its spirit lived on in the hearts of its people. They would find a way to rise from the ashes and show the galaxy that humans could not be broken no matter how hard their enemies tried. As winter approached on Corvax, Prime the Resistance Network had grown to include more than 2,000 prisoners from 40 different species. They had weapons hidden throughout the camp. They had detailed maps of the city's most vulnerable points. They had allies in positions throughout the capital's infrastructure. The survivors of a small farming village had become the leaders of the largest rebellion in Corvani history. The Festival of Conquest was still months away, but preparations were already beginning. Soon the entire galaxy would learn that destroying a human village had been the biggest mistake the Corvani Empire ever made. 6 months had passed since the survivors of Cedar Falls arrived at Corvax Prime, and the resistance network they had helped build was now the largest underground organization in the history of the capital city. Jacob Stone met with cell leaders from dozens of alien species in the abandoned tunnels beneath the industrial district. These maintenance passages had been forgotten by the Corvani decades ago, but they provided perfect hiding, places for secret meetings and weapon storage. The network had grown far beyond what any of them had imagined possible. Dr. Lisa Park's medical connections now reached into every district of the city, including the wealthy areas where Corvani citizens lived. Her reputation as a skilled healer had spread so widely that even some government officials quietly sought her help when the official doctors could not solve their problems. This gave her access to restricted areas and valuable intelligence about the Empire's internal politics. Sam Rodriguez had been promoted to senior maintenance technician, which gave him almost unlimited access to the city's critical infrastructure. He spent his days installing hidden software in communication hubs and power distribution centers. His programs were designed to look like normal system updates, but they contained backdoors that would allow the resistance to take control when the time came. He had also been secretly manufacturing weapons and tools using materials from the factory where he worked. Maria Santos had expanded her trading networks beyond the prison camp to include contacts throughout the city. She now coordinated supply lines that moved everything from food and medicine to weapons and explosives between resistance cells. Her natural talent for negotiation had made her friends among dock workers, transport drivers, and even some low-level government clerks who were tired of the Empire's harsh rule. Danny Mitchell had become something unexpected, a leader who inspired people across species lines. His simple stories about life in Cedar Falls and his dream of returning home to rebuild his farm touched something deep in prisoners who had given up hope years ago. He organized peaceful protests and work slowdowns that frustrated the guards but were hard to punish because they appeared to be accidents or misunderstandings. The resistance faced its biggest test when Corvani security forces discovered one of their weapon caches hidden in an abandoned warehouse. 3 Sirthak resistance members were captured and tortured for information about the network. Everyone expected them to break under interrogation and reveal the names of other members. The entire organization seemed on the verge of collapse, but Jacob had learned from his military days to never put all his trust in one plan. The resistance had been organized into small independent cells that knew very little about each other. Even if the captured Sirthak revealed everything they knew, it would only expose a tiny fraction of the network. The decentralized structure that he had insisted on from the beginning now proved its worth. More importantly, the three prisoners refused to betray their fellow resistance members despite days of brutal treatment. Their sacrifice became a rallying cry that brought new recruits to the cause. Aliens who had been afraid to join the resistance before now volunteered to take the place of those who had been captured. The Corvani attempt to crush the network had only made it stronger. Dr. Lisa Park used her growing influence among Corvani citizens to gather intelligence about the Empire's military capabilities. She learned that many of the warships that had destroyed Cedar Falls were now dealing with rebellions on other worlds. The attack on the human village had inspired similar uprisings throughout the galaxy. The Corvani military was stretched, thin, trying to maintain control over so many different conflicts. She also discovered that there were deep divisions within the Corvani government about how to handle the growing unrest. The military faction wanted to crush all resistance with overwhelming force. The political faction believed that some compromises might be necessary to maintain stability. The economic faction was worried about the cost of constant warfare and wanted to find ways to make the Empire more profitable. Sam Rodriguez made contact with sympathetic aliens who worked in the city's central computer systems. Many of the technicians who maintained Corvax Prime's infrastructure were from conquered species who hated their Corvani overlords. They were willing to help the resistance as long as they could maintain their cover identities. This gave Sam access to the most sensitive systems in the capital, including military communications and government databases. Through these contacts, he learned that the Festival of Conquest would be the biggest celebration in decades. The Corvani High Command wanted to demonstrate their strength after the recent rebellions by putting on the most impressive display of military power in their history. Every important official and military officer would be gathered in the capital for the festivities. It would be the perfect opportunity to strike at the heart of the Empire. Maria Santos expanded her operations to include sympathetic citizens who lived in the city's residential districts. Many aliens who were technically free still faced discrimination and harassment from Corvani authorities. They were willing to provide safe houses and supply storage in exchange for protection from resistance fighters. Her network now included contacts in every major district of the capital. She also established connections with off-world smugglers who brought supplies and information from other rebellious systems. These traders told her that human colonies throughout the galaxy had heard about the destruction of Cedar Falls and were preparing their own resistance movements. The small farming village had become a symbol of defiance that inspired oppressed peoples across dozens of worlds. Danny Mitchell's influence continued to grow as more prisoners and city workers heard his message of hope. He did not call for revenge against the Corvani or promise easy victories. Instead, he talked about the simple dream of going home and rebuilding what had been destroyed. This message resonated with aliens who had their own homes and families they wanted to see again. His speeches were recorded and smuggled throughout the city by Maria's networks. Even some young Corvani citizens began to listen to his words and question whether the Empire's wars of conquest were really necessary. The idea that different species could live together peacefully like they had in Cedar Falls was revolutionary to people who had been taught that only strength mattered. The resistance received unexpected help when a group of Corvani military officers approached Dr. Lisa Park through her medical connections. These officers had grown tired of the endless wars and the brutal treatment of conquered peoples. They were willing to provide intelligence about military movements and security procedures in exchange for guarantees that their families would not be harmed during the uprising. This development forced Jacob to make difficult decisions about who could be trusted and how far the resistance should go in working with former enemies. Some alien members wanted to reject any help from Corvani citizens. Others argued that they needed every advantage they could get. Jacob decided to accept the help, but keep the Corvani contacts isolated from the main resistance network. As winter turned to spring, the preparations for the Festival of Conquest accelerated. The resistance now had detailed maps of the celebration sites, schedules for military ceremonies, and lists of which officials would be attending each event. They had weapons hidden throughout the city and escape routes planned for different scenarios. Most importantly, they had the support of thousands of people who were ready to risk everything for freedom. The final planning meetings were held in the deepest tunnels beneath the city where even the most sophisticated sensors could not detect them. Representatives from every resistance cell gathered to coordinate their roles in the upcoming operation. Surthak fighters would attack government buildings. Velnari infiltrators would sabotage communication systems. Delphon engineers would take control of the transportation networks. And the survivors of Cedar Falls would coordinate the entire operation. Jacob Stone looked around at the faces gathered in the tunnel and marveled at how far they had come. A year ago, they had been simple farmers and shopkeepers living quiet lives in a small village. Now they were leading the largest resistance movement in Corvani history. The Empire had destroyed Cedar Falls to send a message about human weakness. Instead, they had created something much more dangerous. Proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to give up hope. The Festival of Conquest was only weeks away. Soon the galaxy would learn that the destruction of one small human village had planted the seeds for the downfall of an entire empire. The Festival of Conquest began at dawn on the first day of summer, with massive parades marching through the streets of Korvax Prime. Thousands of Corvani soldiers in gleaming armor carried banners representing every world the Empire had conquered. Flying vehicles filled the sky in perfect formations, while crowds of citizens cheered from the sidewalks. The celebration was designed to show the strength and unity of the Empire, but it also created the perfect cover for the largest resistance operation in galactic history. Jacob Stone watched from a maintenance window high above the main parade route as the Corvani leadership gathered on the steps of the Imperial Palace. Emperor Zarthul himself stood at the center wearing ceremonial armor covered in precious metals. Around him were the generals and admirals who commanded the Empire's military forces. These were the people responsible for the destruction of Cedar Falls and the suffering of billions of conquered beings throughout the galaxy. In 12 hours, when the festival reached its climax with a massive fireworks display, the resistance would strike. Every cell leader knew their role, and every fighter was in position. The operation would begin when Sam Rodriguez activated the computer programs he had been installing for months. The city's own systems would turn against their masters, and chaos would give the resistance the opportunity they needed. Dr. Lisa Park was at her assigned position in the medical district, where she had volunteered to provide first aid services during the festival. Her real job was to coordinate communications between the different resistance cells using a network of medical volunteers who could move freely throughout the city. She checked her watch and sent the first coded message to Jacob, confirming that all medical teams were ready. The message traveled through hidden channels that Sam had built into the city's communication system. Within minutes, similar confirmations came back from resistance leaders in every district of Korvax Prime. The Surthak fighters were ready to attack government buildings. The Velnari infiltrators had reached their targets in the communication centers. The Delphon engineers were standing by at critical infrastructure points. Even the sympathetic Corvani officers were in place to help when the time came. Sam Rodriguez was in the central computer facility, pretending to run routine maintenance on the festival's automated systems. He had spent the morning double-checking every program and backdoor he had installed over the past year. When he activated them, the city's traffic control would fail, the power grid would become unstable, and the security systems would turn against their operators. The Corvani had become so dependent on automation that they would be helpless when their machines stopped obeying orders. Maria Santos had positioned supply caches throughout the city, using her network of traders and smugglers. Weapons and medical supplies were hidden in warehouses, abandoned buildings, and even some residential areas where sympathetic aliens lived. As soon as the uprising began, resistance fighters would have access to everything they needed to sustain a long battle. She had also arranged for transport vehicles that could evacuate wounded fighters and non-combatants from dangerous areas. Danny Mitchell was at the agricultural facility where he had been assigned to work, but his real mission was to coordinate the uprising among the thousands of prisoners still held in labor camps around the city. Many of these aliens had been slaves for years and were eager for revenge against their captors. When the signal came, they would overwhelm their guards and join the main resistance force. The simple farmer from Cedar Falls had become the voice of hope for oppressed beings throughout the capital. The first sign of trouble came at noon when traffic control systems began reporting errors throughout the city. Flying vehicles started moving in random directions instead of following their assigned routes. Ground transport stopped at intersections and refused to respond to override commands. The Corvani authorities assumed it was a technical malfunction and ordered emergency repair crews to investigate. But the problem spread faster than they could be fixed. Power fluctuations caused blackouts in several government buildings. Communication networks experienced delays and dropped connections. Security cameras began showing false images or went completely dark. The automated defenses that protected important facilities started targeting Corvani soldiers instead of potential threats. Within 2 hours, the capital city of the most powerful empire in the galaxy was experiencing complete system failures. Emperor Zarthul demanded answers from his technical staff, but no one could explain what was happening. The computers insisted that all systems were functioning normally, even as evidence mounted that nothing was working correctly. Some advisors suggested that enemy agents might be responsible, but the security forces were too busy dealing with their own equipment failures to investigate properly. At exactly 6 o'clock, when the evening celebration was supposed to begin, Sam Rodriguez activated the final phase of his program. Every automated system in Corvax Prime received new instructions that overrode their original programming. Traffic lights turned red in all directions, bringing transportation to a complete halt. Emergency sirens began wailing false alarms throughout the city. The public address system started broadcasting Danny Mitchell's speeches about freedom and hope instead of festival announcements. This was the signal the resistance had been waiting for. In labor camps across the city, thousands of prisoners overwhelmed their guards and seized control of their facilities. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding places and began attacking key government buildings. The carefully coordinated operation unfolded exactly as Jacob Stone had planned, with one major difference. It was succeeding beyond their wildest expectations. The Corvani military response was slow and confused because their communication systems were compromised and their automated weapons were unreliable. Units that tried to move through the city found themselves trapped by traffic jams and blocked roads. Air support was grounded because the flight control computers refused to authorize takeoffs. Even the Imperial Palace was isolated when its defensive shields activated without authorization and locked everyone inside. Jacob Stone led a strike team to capture the Central Command facility where Corvani officers were frantically trying to regain control of their city. The resistance fighters moved through maintenance tunnels they knew better than the enemy and attacked from unexpected directions. Within an hour, they had taken control of the building that coordinated all military operations in the capital. Dr. Lisa Park coordinated medical support for wounded resistance fighters while also treating injured civilians caught in the crossfire. Her network of medical volunteers became an intelligence system that tracked the progress of battles throughout the city. She was amazed to learn that similar uprisings were beginning on other Corvani worlds as news of the rebellion spread through smuggler networks. Maria Santos managed the logistics of the uprising from a hidden command center that moved constantly to avoid detection. Her supply networks kept resistance fighters equipped with weapons and ammunition, while also providing food and shelter for refugees fleeing the battle zones. The trading connections she had built over months of careful work now proved invaluable for sustaining a city-wide rebellion. Danny Mitchell found himself leading thousands of former prisoners as they marched toward the Imperial Palace. Many of these aliens had been slaves for so long, they had forgotten what freedom meant, but his words reminded them of homes and families they thought they would never see again. The young farmer who had just wanted to grow wheat had become the symbol of liberation for an entire planet. As night fell over Corvax Prime, the resistance controlled most of the city, including the spaceport, the main power plants, and all major communication centers. The Corvani government was trapped in their own palace while their military forces were scattered and confused. The empire that had seemed invincible just hours before was collapsing, as its capital fell to rebels it had dismissed as weak and unimportant. But the most important victory was not military. Throughout the galaxy, other oppressed peoples were hearing about the uprising and beginning their own rebellions. The destruction of Cedar Falls that was supposed to demonstrate Corvani strength had instead inspired the largest wave of resistance movements in galactic history. A small farming village had planted seeds that were now bearing fruit across dozens of worlds. Jacob Stone stood on the steps of the captured command center and looked out over a city in flames. The Corvani Empire was not finished yet, and there would be more battles ahead. But tonight belonged to the resistance and to everyone who had dreamed of freedom. The survivors of Cedar Falls had kept their promise to make their enemies pay for destroying their home. 3 days after the uprising began, the fighting in Korvax Prime finally stopped. The resistance controlled every important building in the capital city, while the remaining Corvani military forces had retreated to fortified positions outside the urban area. Emperor Zarthul and most of his government were prisoners in their own palace. The mighty empire that had ruled the galaxy for centuries had lost its heart in less than a week. Jacob Stone stood in what had been the Emperor's private office, looking out at a city that was both victorious and devastated. Smoke still rose from burning buildings. Refugees filled the streets carrying whatever belongings they could save. Dead bodies of both resistance fighters and Corvani soldiers lay in the squares where the heaviest fighting had taken place. Victory had come at a terrible price, and now the survivors had to figure out what to do next. The first challenge was preventing the city from descending into chaos and revenge killings. Many resistance fighters wanted to execute all Corvani officials and military officers as payment for years of oppression. Some alien species that had been enemies under the Empire began fighting each other over territory and resources. Without strong leadership, the liberation of Korvax Prime could easily turn into a bloodbath that would make the Corvani tyranny look merciful. Jacob called a meeting of all resistance leaders in the Great Hall of the Imperial Palace. Representatives from 40 different species gathered around a table where emperors had once planned conquests. The survivors of Cedar Falls sat alongside Surthak warriors, Velnari engineers, Delphon philosophers, and even a few Corvani officers who had joined the rebellion. It was the most diverse governing council in galactic history. The debates were intense and sometimes heated. The Surthak demanded immediate trials for all war criminals. The Velnari wanted to seize Corvani technology and distribute it among the former slave species. The Delphons argued for a complete restructuring of galactic government. Some speakers called for the execution of every Corvani citizen as collective punishment for their empire's crimes. Others wanted to simply replace the old tyranny with a new one, run by the former victims. Jacob listened to every argument before standing to address the assembly. He spoke about the values that had guided Cedar Falls: cooperation instead of domination, justice instead of revenge, building up instead of tearing down. He reminded them that they had not fought to become the new oppressors, but to create something better than what had existed before. The small farming village that had been destroyed, to send a message about human weakness, could now send a different message about the power of mercy and wisdom. Dr. Lisa Park was put in charge of establishing medical services for all inhabitants of the capital, regardless of species or political history. She set up clinics in every district and trained volunteers from different alien races to work together as medical teams. Her first patients included wounded resistance fighters, injured Corvani civilians, and refugees from dozens of different worlds. The doctor who had once treated scraped knees in a country village was now healing the wounds of an entire planet. Her approach to medicine became a model for the new government. She treated everyone who needed help without asking about their past loyalties or crimes. Corvani children received the same care as alien adults. Former slave masters were healed alongside their former victims. This radical concept of universal compassion gradually began to change how different species related to each other in the occupied city. Sam Rodriguez was given the task of rebuilding the city's infrastructure, but with modifications that would serve everyone instead of just the elite. He removed the security systems that had segregated different districts and replaced them with public transportation that connected all neighborhoods. The power grid was redesigned to provide reliable electricity to residential areas that had been neglected under the Empire. Water and waste systems were upgraded to serve the entire population instead of just the wealthy districts. His innovations combined human engineering with alien technologies to create systems that were more efficient and reliable than anything the Corvani had built. Surthak solar collectors powered Velnari manufacturing centers. Delphon water purification plants supplied human agricultural facilities. The former garage mechanic from Cedar Falls had become the chief architect of a new kind of city where different species worked together instead of competing for resources. Maria Santos took charge of establishing fair economic systems that would replace the Empire's extraction-based economy. Under Corvani rule, conquered species had been forced to send tribute to the capital while receiving nothing in return. Maria created trade networks that benefited all participants equally. Her negotiating skills that had once helped a small village get better deals from traveling merchants now helped entire star systems establish mutually beneficial relationships. She also worked to prevent the kind of economic exploitation that had made rebellion necessary in the first place. Markets were regulated to ensure fair prices for both buyers and sellers. Working conditions were improved in factories and mines throughout the system. The wealth that had been concentrated in the hands of a few Corvani nobles was redistributed to fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that benefited everyone. Danny Mitchell faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all. The young farmer who had just wanted to grow wheat and expand his operation was now expected to be a diplomatic leader who could negotiate with representatives from hundreds of different worlds. His simple dream of going home and rebuilding his farm had somehow become a symbol of hope for billions of oppressed beings throughout the galaxy. He established communication networks that allowed different worlds to coordinate their own liberation movements without interference from Korvax Prime. His message was always the same. Every species deserved the right to govern itself and live in peace. The new Galactic Federation would be based on cooperation between equals rather than domination by the strongest. Local communities would make their own decisions about how to live while working together on issues that affected everyone. The transformation of Korvax Prime was not accomplished without setbacks and conflicts. Some Corvani citizens tried to organize counter-rebellions to restore the Empire. A few alien species attempted to establish their own mini-empires in territories they liberated from Corvani control. There were food shortages, power failures, and communication breakdowns as the old systems were replaced with new ones. But gradually the new approach began to work. Crime rates dropped as economic opportunities increased for all species. Different alien communities that had been isolated under the Empire began cultural exchanges that enriched everyone involved. Scientific research accelerated as knowledge was shared freely instead of being hoarded by military organizations. Art and literature flourished as creative expression was no longer restricted by imperial censorship. The most dramatic change came when other star systems began requesting to join the new Federation voluntarily. Worlds that had been conquered by force generations ago now chose to participate in a government based on mutual consent and shared benefits. The Federation grew not through military expansion but through the attractive example of prosperity and freedom it offered to oppressed peoples throughout the galaxy. After 2 years of reconstruction, Jacob Stone finally felt ready to return to New Haven and rebuild Cedar Falls. The capital city was stable under its new government and no longer needed the constant attention of its accidental founders. Dr. Lisa Park had trained local medical staff who could continue her work. Sam Rodriguez had established engineering schools that would maintain and improve the city's systems. Maria Santos had created economic institutions that would ensure fair trade for generations to come. Danny Mitchell had inspired a new generation of leaders who shared his vision of peaceful cooperation. The journey back to New Haven took several weeks on a transport ship filled with other Cedar Falls survivors who were also ready to go home. They found their village exactly as they had left it, a field of ashes and rubble where their homes and farms had once stood. But they also brought with them technologies and knowledge from dozens of different species who wanted to help rebuild the community that had started the Galactic Revolution. The new Cedar Falls that rose from the ruins was unlike any village that had existed before. Human agricultural techniques were combined with Surthak solar power systems and Velnari automated equipment. Delphin water management systems ensured that crops would never fail due to drought. The school taught children from multiple species using educational methods that brought out the best in every type of intelligence. Danny Mitchell planted the first seeds in the rebuilt wheat fields while ambassadors from 50 different worlds watched the ceremony. The grain that grew would feed not just the local community, but would be shared with any world that needed food assistance. The small farm that had been destroyed to demonstrate human weakness had become the symbol of galactic cooperation and mutual. Ada Jacob Stone stood on the porch of his new house drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over fields that stretched to the horizon just as they had before the war. But now those fields were tended by farmers from a dozen different species working together to grow food for the galaxy.